Imagine you could learn every life lesson that matters in one night. Not from books, from the teachers themselves, from an ancient slave who was tortured, a prisoner who survived a death camp, a samurai who killed 61 men, and an emperor who ruled the world. What do you think they would tell you? Tonight, you don't have to imagine. I have distilled wisdom from 21 lives across 25 centuries into 21 life rules, from ancient Athens to 20th century Vienna. But I want to be honest with you before we begin. This isn't a list of nice ideas. These aren't quotes you pin on your wall and forget about by Tuesday. Each lesson was paid for with suffering you can barely imagine. I'll take you on a journey to meet a slave who smiled while his master snapped his leg in two. A young writer who stood before a firing squad, watched the rifles rise, heard the order to fire, and survived. A psychiatrist who rebuilt his life's work from memory while dying of typhus in a Nazi death camp. You won't find this wisdom in modern self-help books or academic journals. It's born from blood, sweat, and tears. The kind of wisdom you pay for with everything you have. But I do promise you this. By the time we reach the end of tonight's journey, I believe you'll discover something that feels like it was meant for you. Something you've always known but never had the words for. A couple of our viewers reached out recently suggesting video ideas. Terry for Henry David Thoreau and Heather for Tolstoy or James Joyce. I appreciate it and will be looking into these. If you have a story or philosophy you believe others should learn, feel free to drop it in the comments. That's the whole point of what we do here. This is a circle of dreamers sharing wisdom at the wee hours of the night and morning. Now, let's settle in. Let a rhythm of peace settle into your body. You don't have to think about it, just let it happen. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of your body against whatever you're resting on. Your bed, your couch, your chair. Feel how the surface holds you up. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to be anywhere. You don't have to solve anything. Your jaw, let it unclench. Your hands, let them open. Your eyes, let them soften. For the next few hours, the only thing you need to do is listen. And if sleep finds you somewhere along the way, that's perfect. That's exactly what's supposed to happen. Now, let's begin. The most powerful philosophy of freedom ever written came from a man who owned nothing, not even his own body. His name was Epictetus, and that name, Epictetus, isn't really a name at all. It's a label. In Greek, it means acquired, like property, like a piece of furniture, because that's what he was, a thing to be bought and sold. He was born around 50 AD in Hierapolis, a dusty town in what is now Turkey. We don't know his birth name. We don't know who his mother was. We know almost nothing about his childhood, except this. At some point, very young, he was taken as a slave to Rome. His master was a man named Epaphroditus. Now, Epaphroditus wasn't just any Roman. He was Nero's personal secretary, one of the most connected men in the empire. And in his household, this slave boy grew up surrounded by power, politics, and the kind of casual cruelty that defined Roman society. And then there's the story of the leg. The ancient sources, Origin, Celsus, tell it differently, but the core is the same. One day, Epaphroditus was twisting the boy's leg. Whether as punishment or sport or simple cruelty, we don't know. What we know is what Epictetus said. He looked at his master and said calmly, "You are going to break it." Epaphroditus kept twisting. The bone snapped. Epictetus didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't beg. He simply said, "There. Did I not tell you that you would break it?" Now, think about that for a moment. Really think about it. A slave, a boy, no power, no rights, no recourse. His master is breaking his leg, and he responds with composure. Not defiance, not rage, composure. As if the breaking of his own body was something happening to someone else. As if he'd already made peace with the fact that his body wasn't his to protect. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. And that limp became, in a strange way, the foundation of everything he would teach. See, Epictetus didn't just endure his slavery, he used it. During his years in Epaphroditus's household, he was allowed to attend lectures by Musonius Rufus, the greatest Stoic teacher of the age. And what Epictetus heard in those lectures confirmed what he'd already learned in his own bones. There are things you can control and things you cannot. The only path to freedom is knowing the difference. After Nero's death in 68 AD, Epictetus was freed. The exact circumstances are murky. Some sources say Epaphroditus freed him willingly. Others suggest it happened during the chaos that followed Nero's suicide. Either way, the slave became a freedman. But here's where it gets interesting. Epictetus didn't do what you'd expect. He didn't try to get rich. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't chase status or comfort. He started teaching. He opened a school in Nicopolis, a small city in western Greece, and the school became famous. Students traveled from across the empire to study with him. Senators came. Generals came. Eventually, Emperor Hadrian himself came to visit. The most powerful man alive, sitting at the feet of a former slave with a broken leg. And what did Epictetus teach them? One idea. One devastating, liberating, life-changing idea. He divided the entire universe into two categories. Things that are up to us, our judgments, our desires, our reactions, our choices, and things that are not up to us, our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, other people's behavior, the weather, the economy, whether we live or die. That's it. That's the whole philosophy. Two categories. And the claim, the radical, counterintuitive, almost insane claim, is that if you focus only on what's up to you and release everything else, you become invincible. Not because nothing bad happens, but because nothing bad can touch the core of who you are. It's not what happens to you, he taught, but how you react to it that matters. Now, I know what you might be thinking. That sounds nice, Huxley. Very philosophical. But does it actually work? Can you really just not care about what happens to your body, your career, your family? Well, consider this. Nearly 2,000 years after Epictetus taught in that little school in Nicopolis, a man named James Stockdale was shot down over North Vietnam. He was captured, tortured, held as a prisoner of war for 7.5 years. And in the moments before his parachute hit the ground, as he was falling into what would become years of unimaginable suffering, Stockdale thought one thing: I'm leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. He'd studied the discourses in graduate school, and for 7 years in a Vietnamese prison cell, Epictetus's philosophy kept him sane, kept him alive, kept him from breaking. The irony is almost too perfect. A philosophy born in the chains of a Roman slave, saving the sanity of an American prisoner of war 2 millennia later. And there's one more detail I love. Epictetus never wrote a single word. Not one. Everything we have, the discourses, the Enchiridion, every quote, every teaching, was written down by his student Arian, who sat in those lectures and took notes like his life depended on it. Which, in a way, it did. There's even a story, and this one always makes me smile, about Epictetus's lamp. He had a simple iron lamp by his door. Someone stole it. Instead of getting angry, Epictetus replaced it with a clay lamp. The thief, he said, lost more than I did. He lost his honesty. I only lost a lamp. Years later, after Epictetus died, that clay lamp sold at auction for an enormous sum. People will pay a fortune for the possessions of a man who taught that possessions mean nothing. Here's what I want you to take from this. Every frustration you feel, the traffic that makes you late, the boss who doesn't listen, the body that doesn't cooperate, the economy that doesn't care about your plans, falls into one of 2 categories. Either it's up to you, or it's not. And the moment you stop trying to control what you can't, everything changes. Not outside, inside, where it matters. Epictetus showed us that freedom starts in the mind. He proved it with his life. A slave's life, a broken leg, a clay lamp, and an unshakable calm that outlasted an empire. But there's a kind of wound even deeper than grief. The wound of injustice, of being caged, punished, dehumanized for decades. And our next story asks the hardest question on this entire list. What do you do with that wound? Do you let it harden into hatred? Or do you let it go? If these stories speak to you, if you find comfort in the lessons found in the quiet corners of history, tap the follow button to join our circle of dreamers, and let the next story find you when you need it most. You can also find a full episode on Epictetus here on the channel. He spent 27 years in a prison cell, and when he finally walked out, the world expected rage. What they got was something far more powerful. His name was Nelson Mandela, and his story is proof that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the most radical act of freedom a human being can perform. Mandela was arrested in 1962 for his role in the fight against apartheid, South Africa's brutal system of racial segregation. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was 37 years old. For the next 18 years, he was held on Robben Island, a windswept rock in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Cape Town. His cell was 7 feet by 9 feet. He slept on a thin mat on the stone floor. He was forced to do hard labor in a lime quarry, breaking rocks under the blazing sun. The lime dust permanently damaged his eyesight. He was allowed 1 visitor every 6 months, 1 letter every 6 months. His mail was censored. His conversations were monitored. The guards were instructed to dehumanize him, to break his spirit, to reduce him from a man to a number, for 27 years. And here is what Mandela did with those 27 years. He studied. He earned a law degree through correspondence. He read voraciously. He debated politics and philosophy with fellow prisoners. He maintained a daily exercise routine in his cell. He grew a garden in the prison courtyard. And he did something that nobody expected. He learned Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors, the language of the guards who humiliated him, the judges who sentenced him, the politicians who built the system that caged him. He didn't learn it to curse them. He learned it to understand them. If you talk to a man in a language he understands, Mandela later said, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. When Mandela walked out of Viktor prison on February 11th, 1990, he was 71 years old. He'd entered prison as a young, angry revolutionary. He emerged as something else entirely. The world braced for retribution, for score settling, for the violence that almost always follows when the oppressed finally gain power. South Africa was a tinderbox, and everyone knew it. What Mandela did instead was almost incomprehensible. He negotiated with the apartheid government. He sat across the table from the men who had imprisoned him for a generation. And he negotiated a peaceful transition to democracy. He invited his former prison guard to his presidential inauguration as an honored guest. And in 1995, at the Rugby World Cup held in South Africa, Mandela walked onto the field wearing a Springbok rugby jersey. The Springboks were the symbol of white South African sport, the team that black South Africans had been taught to hate. Mandela wore the jersey. He shook hands with the players. The stadium, overwhelmingly white, chanted his name. In that moment, a nation that should have torn itself apart came together. As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, Mandela wrote, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison. Read that again. He knew that carrying hatred out of prison would mean never truly leaving it. That bitterness is its own cage. That the only way to be free, truly, completely, irrevocably free, was to forgive. Not to forget. Not to excuse. Not to pretend the suffering didn't happen. But to refuse to let the suffering define him. To choose, deliberately and consciously, to build something new rather than destroy something old. That's the hardest rule on this list. Harder than facing a firing squad. Harder than surviving a concentration camp. Harder than walking into the mountains and disappearing. Because forgiveness asks you to do something that every instinct in your body resists. Let go of the thing that hurt you most. Here's what Mandela teaches us. Whatever you're holding on to tonight, whatever grudge, whatever resentment, whatever old wound you keep reopening, it's not punishing the person who hurt you. It's punishing you. You're sitting in a cell of your own making, and the door has been unlocked for years. Mandela walked through that door. He chose freedom over vengeance, healing over hatred, the future over the past. You can too. Mandela freed himself by forgiving others. But what happens when the mind itself is pushed to its absolute breaking point? When you're not just enduring suffering, but staring directly into the face of death. If death came for you tonight, quietly, suddenly, who would you become in those final moments when there's no time left to pretend? The snow in the square had not yet melted, though spring had technically arrived. A bitter wind cut through the thin prison shirts of the 20 men standing in a line, wrists bound, eyes wide with the sick clarity of those who know they are about to die. Among them stood 28-year-old Fyodor Dostoevsky, trembling, not from fear, but from something stranger, a numbness that was almost peaceful. The officer shouted the command. The soldiers lifted their rifles. A priest walked down the line, holding a cross. Some prisoners sobbed, others prayed, a few cursed. Dostoevsky simply stared up at the sky, thinking, if only I could live again, just a little, how precious life would be. The prisoners were divided into groups of 3. Dostoevsky was in the second group, forced to watch as the first men were led to the posts, tied, blindfolded. The sound of ropes tightening, the scrape of boots on frozen stone, the metallic click of rifles being loaded. He watched a man beside him collapse in tears. Another shouted defiance at the sky. One went utterly still, eyes vacant. His mind had already fled somewhere the body could not follow. Dostoevsky felt time stretch and compress simultaneously. He later wrote to his brother that he had spent 3/4 of an hour convinced he would die. 3/4 of an hour to measure his entire life against eternity. In those moments, he thought about the books he'd never write, the love he'd never know, the mistakes he'd made, especially the mistakes. How much time had he wasted? How much life had he lived wrong? The rifles leveled, the drums rolled. Before we find out what happens to Dostoevsky, let's first find out how he got here. Dostoevsky, at 28, was a promising young novelist. He'd published his first book, Poor Folk, to enormous acclaim. Critics called him the next Gogol. He was brilliant, sensitive, prone to grand passions and dark moods. And he'd made one catastrophic mistake. He'd joined the Petrushevsky Circle, a group of intellectuals who met in secret to discuss banned books and radical ideas about freedom and equality. In the Russia of Tsar Nicholas I, this was a death sentence. They were arrested in April 1849. Dostoevsky spent 8 months in the Peter and Paul Fortress, one of the most notorious prisons in Russia. He didn't know what his sentence would be. He didn't know if he'd live or die. For 8 months he sat in a cell and waited. And then they brought him to the square. The prisoners were divided into groups of 3. The first group was led to the wooden stakes and tied in place. Hoods were lowered over their eyes. The firing squad raised their rifles. Dostoevsky was in the second group. He was next. He had, by his own calculation, about 60 seconds left to live. He wrote about it later, in a letter to his brother Mikhail, one of the most extraordinary documents in literary history. He described the quality of the light, the color of the sky, a church dome gleaming in the distance. He described how, in those final seconds, his mind divided the remaining time into 3 portions. 2 minutes to say goodbye to his companions, 2 minutes to think about himself for the last time, and 2 minutes to simply look around. "I remembered you, brother," he wrote, "only you, at that final instant." The rifles were aimed, fingers pressed against triggers, and then a drum roll. A messenger galloped into the square on horseback, waving a white flag. The Tsar had issued a last-minute reprieve. The execution was commuted to hard labor in Siberia. But here's the thing no one tells you. It wasn't mercy. It was theater. Tsar Nicholas I had planned the entire charade in advance. A psychological torture designed to break the prisoners before sentencing them to years of suffering. The reprieve was never in doubt. The rifles were never loaded. The whole thing was staged, and it worked. One of the prisoners, Nikolai Grigoriev, went permanently insane on the spot. He never recovered. His mind simply shattered. But Dostoevsky didn't shatter. Something else happened to him. Something no one, least of all the Tsar, could have predicted. In those 60 seconds before the rifles, Dostoevsky had experienced something extraordinary. Time expanded. Colors became vivid. The light on that church dome became the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Every breath felt like an eternity. He'd been given the gift that only those who face death receive. The knowledge that every single moment is precious beyond measure. And now, he was alive. Impossibly, absurdly alive. What followed was 4 years in a Siberian prison camp. The conditions were brutal. Freezing cold, back-breaking labor. Chains that weighed 10 pounds. He described it later in The House of the Dead, one of the first great prison memoirs. He was surrounded by murderers, thieves, and madmen. He developed epilepsy, probably triggered by the stress of his imprisonment. The seizures would torment him for the rest of his life. But even the epilepsy gave him something strange and terrible and beautiful. Before each seizure, he experienced what he called an ecstatic aura, a moment of absolute clarity and cosmic harmony, a feeling that everything in the universe was exactly as it should be. Then the seizure would hit, and he'd collapse. He described this experience through Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, a moment of understanding so total that it was worth a lifetime of ordinary consciousness. When he emerged from Siberia, Dostoevsky was a different man. The liberal intellectual who went in, the drawing-room philosopher who liked to discuss ideas over tea, was gone. In his place was someone who had touched the very bottom of human experience and found something there, not despair, meaning. He went on to write the greatest novels in the history of literature, Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot, Demons, each one a descent into the darkest corners of the human soul, each one illuminated by a strange, fierce compassion that could only come from someone who had been there himself. The darker the night, he wrote, the brighter the stars, the deeper the grief, the closer is God. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing his own experience. The darkest night of his life, standing in that square 60 seconds from death, had produced the brightest stars. The grief of Siberia had brought him closer to something he couldn't name but couldn't deny. And here's what that means for you. When you're in the darkest chapter of your life, and we all have them, those seasons where nothing makes sense and the pain feels unbearable, you're not failing. You're not being punished. You are gathering material. Every grief, every failure, every humiliation is adding depth to who you are becoming. Dostoevsky didn't succeed despite his suffering. He succeeded because of it. The Tsar tried to break him with the ultimate psychological torture, and instead created the greatest novelist who ever lived. The darker the night, the brighter the stars. Dostoevsky survived the firing squad and transformed his suffering into art. If you'd like to learn the full story and life wisdom of Dostoevsky, I have a dedicated episode on the channel. It's one of our most loved episodes. You'd really enjoy it. A homeless man, living in a clay jar, owning nothing but a cloak and a wooden stick. And when the most powerful conqueror in the history of the world offered him anything he wanted, he said, "Yeah, move, you're blocking my sun." His name was Diogenes, Diogenes of Sinope, and he is without question the funniest philosopher who ever lived. But don't let the humor fool you. Behind the jokes, behind the outrageous behavior, behind every scandalous stunt, there's a wisdom so radical that 2,400 years later, we're still not sure the world is ready for it. Let me tell you how he got here. Diogenes was born around 413 BC in Sinope, a Greek colony on the Black Sea coast of what is now Turkey. His father was a banker, a respectable man, a man of standing. And then his father was caught debasing the currency, shaving coins, mixing cheap metal into the silver. In the ancient world, this was a catastrophic crime. The family was disgraced and exiled. Now, most people would have been destroyed by this. The shame alone would have been crippling. But Diogenes? Diogenes took it as a mission statement. If his father was exiled for debasing the physical currency, then Diogenes would spend his life debasing the social currency, the fake values, the hollow customs, the meaningless rituals that people clung to as if they mattered. When someone reminded him of his exile, he said, "I have condemned them to stay where they are." Think about that. He reframed exile, one of the worst punishments in the ancient world, as freedom. Everyone else was trapped. He was the one who got away. He arrived in Athens and immediately began living in a way designed to shock every sensibility the Greeks held dear. He moved into a large ceramic storage jar, a pithos, in the Athenian marketplace. Not a house, not even a tent, a jar. He ate whatever he could find. He begged for food. He performed all bodily functions in public, arguing that if something was natural, there was no reason to hide it. He walked through the streets of Athens in broad daylight, carrying a lit lantern. When people asked what he was doing, he said, "I am looking for an honest man." He searched the marketplace, the temples, the government buildings. He never found one. When Plato, the great philosopher, the founder of the academy, perhaps the most respected intellectual in Athens, defined a human being as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken and walked into one of Plato's lectures, holding it aloft. "Behold," he announced, "Plato's man." Plato, to his credit, had to add, "with broad flat nails," to his definition afterward. Now these stories are entertaining, but they're not just comedy. Every single one is making a philosophical point. The lantern says, "Honesty is so rare, it might as well not exist." The chicken says, "Reductive definitions miss what's essential about being human." The jar says, "Everything you think you need, you don't." And then there's the encounter. The encounter. The one everyone remembers. In 336 BC, Alexander the Great arrived in Corinth. He was 20 years old. He had just consolidated power over all of Greece. He was about to launch the military campaign that would conquer the entire known world. Every philosopher, politician, and dignitary in Corinth came to pay their respects to the new king. Everyone except Diogenes. Diogenes didn't come, didn't send a message, didn't acknowledge Alexander's existence. Alexander was intrigued. He was 20 and the most powerful person alive, and someone was ignoring him. He went to find Diogenes himself. He found him lying in a vacant lot, sunbathing, surrounded by a small crowd who had come to see the philosopher in his natural habitat, like tourists visiting a zoo. Alexander approached. His retinue fell silent. The conqueror of the world stood over the homeless philosopher in the dirt. "I am Alexander the Great," he said. "I am Diogenes the dog," came the reply. The cynics called themselves dogs. Kynikos in Greek, embracing the insult as a badge of honor. "Is there anything I can do for you?" Alexander asked. And he meant it. This was a genuine offer. "Anything, gold, land, power, whatever you want." Diogenes looked up at the shadow blocking his sunlight. "Yes," he said, "stand a little out of my sun." The crowd gasped. Alexander's generals were appalled. You don't speak to the conqueror of the world like that. You don't dismiss the most powerful man alive as an inconvenience. But Alexander laughed. As he walked away, he turned to his entourage and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Now, let that sink in. The man who conquered nations, who commanded armies, who was worshipped as a god in some territories, envied a homeless man in a clay jar. Because Alexander, for all his power, understood something. Diogenes had the one thing Alexander couldn't conquer: freedom from desire, freedom from need, freedom from the relentless hunger for more that drove Alexander across continents and would eventually kill him at 32. Alexander could conquer the world, but he couldn't conquer his own desires. Diogenes wanted nothing, and wanting nothing, he was the freest man alive. There's a detail about Diogenes' death that I love. He died in Corinth in 323 BC. On the same day, according to tradition, that Alexander the Great died in Babylon, the conqueror and the philosopher departing the world together. When someone asked Diogenes what should be done with his body after death, he said, "Throw it outside the city walls for the dogs." "But won't the wild beasts tear you apart?" they asked. "Then lay a stick beside me so I can drive them away." "How can you drive them away if you're dead? You won't feel anything." "If I don't feel anything," Diogenes replied, "why would I care about wild beasts?" Logic, even in death. The citizens of Corinth ignored his wishes. They buried him with honors. They erected a monument with a marble dog on top. The man who wanted nothing received everything. Here's the lesson, and it might be the most important one tonight. The things you think you need are exactly what enslave you. The bigger house, the newer car, the next promotion, the next upgrade, the next subscription. We live in a world of endless acquisition, and we're told by every ad, every algorithm, every cultural message that happiness is one more purchase away. Diogenes says, you're looking in the wrong direction. Happiness isn't addition, it's subtraction. It's not about getting more, It's about wanting less. And the moment you stop needing things from the world can't touch you. What if the path to peace isn't building a bigger life, but wanting a simpler one? What if freedom isn't about having everything, but about being content with what you have? Diogenes lived in a jar, owned nothing, answered to no one, and was envied by the most powerful man on earth. 2,400 years later, his question is still the most important one. What do you actually need? Diogenes stripped life down to nothing and found happiness there. But there was another man, born half a century later, who would face something far worse and transform suffering into the most important psychological insight of the 20th century. He was a rising star. By the time he was 15 years old, Viktor Frankl was corresponding with Sigmund Freud. Think about that. 15, writing letters to the founder of psychoanalysis, and Freud writing back. Freud was so impressed with one of Frankl's papers that he submitted it for publication himself, a teenager, publishing in a professional journal with Freud as his champion. By 25, Frankl had done something no one thought possible. He'd organized youth counseling centers across Vienna, free clinics where teenagers could come for help during the critical period around report card season when student suicides typically spiked. And it worked. For the first time in years, there were 0 student suicides in Vienna during that period. Not a single one. By his early 30s, he was running the neurology department at Rothschild Hospital, Vienna's last remaining hospital for Jewish patients after the Nazi annexation. He was treating patients. He was refining his theory. Logotherapy, the idea that the primary drive of human life isn't pleasure, as Freud taught, or power, as Adler taught, but meaning. He'd spent 20 years developing this theory. 20 years of case studies, observations, clinical work, and he'd written it all down in a manuscript that represented his entire intellectual life. When the deportation order came in 1942, he made a desperate choice. He had the opportunity to escape. He'd been granted a visa to the United States. He could have left. He could have saved himself. But his parents couldn't leave. Frankl looked at the visa. He looked at his elderly father, and he stayed. His wife, Tilly, helped him sew the manuscript into the lining of his coat. Every page, every idea, every breakthrough, hidden in the stitches. It was, in a way, his entire self reduced to paper and thread. You already know what happened next. Theresienstadt first, then Auschwitz. The coat was stripped away in the processing line. 20 years of work, gone in a moment. But it wasn't just the manuscript. His father died at Theresienstadt. Starvation and pneumonia. Frankl had managed to obtain some morphine and injected it to ease his father's final hours. It's one of the few moments in his memoirs where his clinical composure breaks. You can feel the sun underneath the psychiatrist. The boy who just wants his father to stop hurting. His mother was sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. His brother Walter was killed in a mining operation at Auschwitz. His wife Tilly was transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where she would die of exhaustion and disease. Frankl didn't learn about any of these deaths until after liberation. For years, he held on to the hope that someone, anyone, had survived. No one had. Now, here is where the story becomes something more than tragedy. Here is where Viktor Frankl earned the right to teach the world about meaning. In the camps, Frankl observed something that the other prisoners, and even the guards, couldn't see. He noticed that the prisoners who survived weren't necessarily the youngest, or the strongest, or the healthiest. They were the ones who had something to live for. One man survived because he had a child waiting for him in another country. Another survived because he had a scientific manuscript to complete. A third survived because he'd made a promise to a friend. The ones who gave up, who said, "I have nothing left to live for," died within days, sometimes within hours. Their bodies simply stopped. Not from disease or starvation, although those were everywhere. From emptiness, from the loss of meaning itself. Frankl was watching his own theory prove itself in the most extreme laboratory in human history. And then something happened that should have killed him. He contracted typhus. In the camps, typhus was usually a death sentence. Your body burns with fever. You can't eat. You can barely think. Many prisoners simply fell asleep and never woke up. Their hearts gave out during the delirium. Frankl knew this. As a doctor, he knew exactly what was happening to his body. And he knew that if he fell asleep during the worst of the fever, he might not wake up. So he did something extraordinary. He kept himself awake by mentally reconstructing the lost manuscript. Page by page, argument by argument, case study by case study. 20 years of work, rebuilt from memory in the delirium of typhus in a concentration camp while his body was trying to die. A fellow prisoner, risking severe punishment, smuggled him scraps of paper and a pencil stub. And there, on the backs of SS documents and scraps of packaging, Frankl scribbled notes. Fragments of the theory he'd spent his life developing, now being reborn in the most impossible circumstances imaginable. He survived the typhus. He survived the camps. On April 27, 1945, the camp at Turkheim was liberated by American forces. Frankl walked out. He was skeletal. He was alone. Everyone he loved was dead. And 9 days later, he began dictating a book. It took him 9 days to dictate the first draft of man's search for meaning. 9 days. He poured everything into it. The observations from the camps, the theory of logotherapy, the stories of those who survived and those who didn't. He wanted to publish it anonymously, without his name on the cover. His friends convinced him otherwise. The book has sold over 16 million copies. It's been translated into more than 50 languages. The Library of Congress named it one of the 10 most influential books in America. And at its heart, one sentence, one idea. The one that emerged from the ashes of everything he'd lost. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Now, I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to hear that and think Frankl was saying, just think positive. He wasn't. He despised cheap optimism. He wasn't saying suffering doesn't matter, or that you can just smile your way through a concentration camp. He was saying something far more radical. He was saying that meaning is always available, even in the worst moment of your life, even when everything has been stripped away, Even when you're dying of typhus on the floor of a barracks, scribbling on stolen paper, there is always, always a choice about how to respond. And that choice, that tiny, invisible, indestructible choice, is what makes us human. You don't need to have been in a concentration camp for this to matter. Look around at the world right now. So many people have everything: comfort, security, entertainment, choices, and yet feel empty. Frankl had a word for this. He called it the existential vacuum. The hollow feeling that comes from pursuing pleasure without purpose, comfort without meaning, success without significance. If you feel that emptiness, if you sense that something is missing despite having more than any previous generation in human history, Frankl's insight is for you. You're not broken. You're not ungrateful. You're searching for meaning. And meaning doesn't come from having more. It comes from giving yourself to something larger than yourself. The manuscript the Nazis destroyed was reborn as something far more powerful. The man who lost everything became the world's foremost teacher on why life is worth living. And that is the most human story ever told. Frankl's insight was forged in the most extreme conditions imaginable. But you don't have to suffer to learn these lessons. In fact, the next rule comes from a man who had everything: absolute power over millions of lives, and still understood that none of it mattered. A man who sat alone in a cold military tent, writing reminders to himself about how to be a decent human being. The ruler of the Roman Empire, and the private diary no one was ever supposed to read. He was the most powerful man in the known world. And every night, by candlelight in a military tent on the frozen banks of the Danube, he wrote a diary reminding himself to be humble. His name was Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commander of the most devastating military force on earth, ruler of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara. 60 million people lived and died at his word. And yet, the diary he wrote was not about conquests, not about glory, not about power. It was about trying to get through the day. Now, here's what you need to understand about Marcus Aurelius. He never wanted to be emperor, not even a little bit. He was adopted into the imperial line by Emperor Antoninus Pius, essentially chosen for the job because he seemed honest and capable. Marcus was a philosopher, a reader, a quiet man who would have been perfectly content to spend his life in a library, studying Stoic texts and debating ideas with friends. Instead, he got a plague, 3 wars, a famine, and a betrayal. The Antonine Plague, which was almost certainly smallpox, swept through the Roman Empire starting in 165 AD. It killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. Entire cities were emptied. The army, which was the backbone of Roman power, lost so many soldiers that Marcus had to recruit gladiators and slaves to fill the ranks. He even auctioned off imperial furniture and his wife's silk dresses to fund the military campaigns rather than raise taxes on a suffering population. Then came the Germanic tribes, flooding across the Danube frontier. Wave after wave of invasion. Marcus spent most of the last decade of his life in military camps along the northern border, fighting wars he didn't want to fight, surrounded by death and cold and misery. His co-emperor Lucius Verus died of plague. His general Avidius Cassius betrayed him, declaring himself emperor in the east. Marcus put down the rebellion, but instead of executing Cassius's supporters, which was the Roman way, the expected way, he pardoned them. He burned Cassius's letters unread so that no one could be implicated. And through all of this, the plague, the wars, the betrayals, the endless suffering, he sat in his tent at night and wrote, Ta eis huton, to himself. That's what he called it, not meditations. That's what we call it. He called it notes to himself, reminders. A private conversation between Marcus the philosopher and Marcus the emperor. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. Think about that last one for a moment. The most powerful man alive, reminding himself in a private diary that nobody was supposed to read. To just be a good person. To stop overthinking it and simply show up and do the right thing. There's something almost heartbreaking about that. Something deeply, fundamentally human. Because it means that even the man who had everything, absolute power, unlimited resources, the ability to do anything to anyone, still struggled with the same things you and I struggle with. Anxiety, self-doubt, the temptation to lose his temper, the fear that none of it matters. The Meditations was never meant to be published. Marcus wrote it for himself, about himself, to himself. That's what makes it the most honest book ever written. There's no audience to impress, no students to teach, no legacy to build. It's just a man, alone in a tent, trying to hold himself together while the world falls apart. He died on March 17th, 180 AD on the frontier, during one of his campaigns. The plague may have taken him, or exhaustion, or simply the accumulated weight of carrying an empire on his shoulders for nearly 20 years. He was the last of the 5 good emperors. After him came Commodus, his son, and the long decline began. But the diary survived, lost for centuries, rediscovered in the 9th or 10th century, first printed in 1558, and since then it has been read by presidents, generals, athletes, CEOs, and millions of ordinary people looking for guidance in difficult times. Here's what I take from Marcus Aurelius. If the emperor of Rome, the man who controlled legions, who decided the fate of nations, who could have literally anything he wanted, if that man struggled with anxiety and self-doubt, then you're allowed to as well. The point isn't to eliminate the struggle. The point is to show up every day and do the work anyway. Write the diary. Fight the battle. Be the person you know you should be, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor who found peace through writing. The next story is about a warrior who found it through something very different: silence and the emptiness of a cave. He killed his first man at 13, not in battle, not in self-defense, in a formal duel. A 13-year-old boy against a trained adult samurai named Arima Kihei. The boy won. The man died. His name was Miyamoto Musashi, and over the next 30 years, he would fight 61 duels, every single one to the death, or near enough, and never lose. Not once. Now, I want you to hold that image in your mind, because the destination of this story is going to surprise you. Musashi was born around 1584 in rural Japan, during the Sengoku period, an era of near-constant warfare. His mother died. His father, a martial artist himself, was either absent or abusive, depending on the account. The boy was essentially raised by the sword. After that first kill at 13, Musashi left home. He became a ronin, a masterless samurai, a wanderer. For the next 3 decades he traveled across Japan, seeking the most skilled swordsmen he could find and challenging them to combat. This practice was called Musha Shugyo, the warrior's pilgrimage, a journey of self-improvement through mortal danger. And the stories, well, the stories are extraordinary. He fought an entire clan, multiple opponents at once, and survived. He developed a 2-sword fighting technique called Niten Ichiryu, wielding a long sword and a short sword simultaneously, which was considered impossible and borderline insane. There's a famous account that claims he never bathed, never cut his hair, and never married, because he refused to be caught unarmed or distracted, even for a moment. But the duel everyone remembers is the one on Ganryu Island. In 1612, Musashi challenged Sasaki Kojiro, who was considered the greatest swordsman in Japan. Kojiro was famous for his swallow cut, a technique so fast it could supposedly cut a bird in mid-flight. The duel was arranged on a small island in the strait between Honshu and Kyushu. Musashi arrived late, very late, deliberately. He came by boat, and during the crossing he carved a weapon out of a spare boat oar, just whittled a wooden sword from a piece of wood while everyone waited. Kojiro was furious. That was the point. When Musashi finally stepped onto the beach, Kojiro drew his famous long sword and threw the scabbard away, a gesture that meant he didn't expect to need it again. Musashi said, "If you had any chance of winning, you would have kept the scabbard." One strike. The oar sword came down. Kojiro fell. The greatest swordsman in Japan, killed by a boat oar. Now, here is where the story turns. After decades of this, decades of killing, of wandering, of living on the razor's edge between life and death, Musashi stopped. Around age 50, he put down the sword, and he picked up a paintbrush. The deadliest man in Japan became an artist. He began painting in the Suibokuga style, inkwash paintings of startling beauty and simplicity. Birds, branches, a cormorant on a rock, each one spare, precise, and somehow full of the same discipline that had made him invincible with a blade. He studied calligraphy. He studied poetry. He studied Buddhism. The warrior became a monk. The killer became a philosopher. And in the final months of his life, dying of what was likely thoracic cancer, Musashi retreated to a cave. The Regando, the Spirit Rock Cave, near Kumamoto. There, in solitude and meditation, with his life draining away, he wrote 2 texts that would outlast every sword stroke he'd ever made. The first was The Book of 5 Rings, a treatise on strategy, combat, and the nature of mastery, divided into 5 books named after the elements: earth, water, fire, Wind and Void. It became one of the most influential strategy texts in history. The second was the Dokudo, The Way of Walking Alone. 21 precepts written 1 week before his death. And these are something else entirely. Accept everything just the way it is. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. Do not, under any circumstances, depend on a partial feeling. Do not fear death. 1 week before he died, Musashi gave away every possession he owned. Every sword, every painting, every material thing he'd accumulated in 60 years of life. He entrusted his writings to his closest student, knelt in meditation, and died. And here is the wisdom that the deadliest man in Japan left behind. There is nothing outside of yourself that can ever enable you to get better, stronger, richer, quicker, or smarter. Everything is within. Everything exists. Seek nothing outside of yourself. Everything is within. After 61 duels, after 30 years of wandering, after killing more men in single combat than anyone in recorded Japanese history, after painting and writing and meditating and giving it all away, his final conclusion was this: the real battle was never external. The real opponent was always, always, always himself. Whatever external battles you're fighting right now, the work stress, the health problems, the relationship conflicts, the financial fears, Musashi would tell you the same thing he told his students 500 years ago. Stop looking outside. The answer isn't there. It never was. Musashi found peace by going inside. The next thinker found genius there too, but at a terrible cost. The man who literally powered the modern world died alone in a hotel room, penniless, feeding pigeons. His name was Nikola Tesla. And his story is one of the most tragic arcs in the history of science. Tesla arrived in the United States in 1884 with 4 cents in his pocket and a head full of impossible ideas. He briefly worked for Thomas Edison, who dismissed his theories about alternating current as dangerous nonsense. The two men parted ways, and what followed was the famous War of Currents, one of the most dramatic rivalries in scientific history. Edison championed direct current, DC. Tesla believed in alternating current, AC. Edison publicly electrocuted animals to prove that AC was deadly. He even lobbied to have the electric chair use AC, so the public would associate Tesla's invention with death. Tesla won. AC was simply better. It could travel longer distances, power entire cities, light up the world. Tesla partnered with George Westinghouse, and together they built the electrical infrastructure that powers civilization to this day. Every time you turn on a light, charge your phone, or plug in anything, you're using Tesla's technology. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody sees coming. Westinghouse's company was in financial trouble. The royalty payments owed to Tesla were enormous. By some estimates, they would have been worth over $300 million in today's money. Westinghouse himself came to Tesla and explained the situation. The company might go bankrupt. If it did, the spread of AC power across America could be set back by decades. Tesla looked at the contract. He looked at Westinghouse, and he tore it up. $300 million gone, in a single gesture. He didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. He didn't ask for partial payment. He simply let it go, because the technology mattered more to him than the money. The future of human civilization mattered more than his own fortune. It was the most selfless act in the history of invention, and it was also the beginning of his ruin. Without those royalties, Tesla was financially vulnerable for the rest of his life. He poured his remaining resources into increasingly ambitious projects. The Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island, designed to transmit wireless energy across the entire planet. Free power for everyone. No wires, no meters, no bills. When his financier J.P. Morgan realized that Tesla wanted to give away energy rather than sell it, he pulled the funding. If anyone can draw on the power, Morgan reportedly asked, "Where do we put the meter?" The tower was demolished. Tesla's dream died with it. The decades that followed were a slow, painful decline. Tesla lost control of his patents. He was abandoned by business partners. At one point, the man who invented the modern electrical grid was digging ditches for $2 a day. He ended up in room 3327 of the Hotel New Yorker. 33rd floor. He was obsessed with the number 3. He lived there alone for years, spending his days in Bryant Park, feeding pigeons. And here is the detail that haunts me. Tesla fell in love with a pigeon, a particular white pigeon with grey-tipped wings. He told his biographer, John O'Neill, "I loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and she loved me. As long as I had her, there was a purpose to my life." One night, the white pigeon flew into his window to die. Tesla said that a light shone from her eyes, brighter than anything he had ever generated with his electrical machinery. He told friends that in that moment his life's work was finished. On January 7th, 1943, Tesla died alone in his hotel room. A maid found his body 2 days later, after ignoring his "Do Not Disturb" sign. He was 86 years old. After his death, FBI agents seized his papers. An MIT scientist named John G. Trump, yes, the uncle of that Trump, evaluated them and declared them primarily of a speculative, philosophical, and promotional character. The man who invented the modern world was dismissed as a dreamer, even in death. Be alone, Tesla had said. That is the secret of invention. Be alone, that is when ideas are born. And he was right. His greatest breakthroughs, the rotating magnetic field, the AC motor, wireless transmission, all came in moments of intense solitude. Tesla could visualize complete inventions in his mind, testing them mentally before building a single component. He didn't need collaborators. He needed silence. But solitude is a double-edged sword. The same isolation that birthed his inventions eventually consumed his humanity. The man who chose to be alone for the sake of genius ended up alone in the most devastating sense possible. Here's what I want you to take from Tesla's story. In a world of constant noise, notifications, meetings, social media, the endless chatter of a connected life, we've forgotten how to be alone with our thoughts. Tesla reminds us that the most important ideas arrive in silence, that there is something sacred about solitude, something necessary. But he also warns us, solitude can create, and solitude can destroy. The question isn't whether to be alone, it's whether you control your solitude, or it controls you. Tesla's solitude was chosen. But what about someone who had solitude forced upon them, who lost everything in a single catastrophic moment and transformed that destruction into something entirely new? Stoicism, the philosophy that shaped empires, survived millennia, and is practiced by millions of people today. From corporate boardrooms to prison cells to self-help bestsellers. It was born because one man lost everything in a shipwreck. His name was Zeno, Zeno of Citium, and before he was a philosopher, he was a merchant, a very successful one. Zeno grew up in Citium, on the island of Cyprus, around 334 BC. His family was Phoenician, the great seafaring traders of the ancient Mediterranean. He inherited the family business and became wealthy dealing in one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world, Tyrian purple dye. This wasn't ordinary dye. It was extracted from the mucus of sea snails, thousands of snails for a single gram of pigment. It was, pound for pound, more valuable than gold. Kings wore it, emperors demanded it, and Zeno traded it. Then, one day, his ship sank. We don't know the exact details. A storm, probably. The Mediterranean could be treacherous, and even experienced Phoenician sailors were at its mercy. What we know is that Zeno's entire fortune, his cargo, his investment, his future, went to the bottom of the sea. He washed up in Athens, penniless, alone, a merchant with nothing to sell, in a city where he knew no one. Now, what do you do when you lose everything? When the life you built is gone, and you're standing in a strange place, with nothing but the clothes on your back? Most people would panic. Most people would grieve. Most people would try to rebuild what they'd lost, scrape together some money, buy another ship, get back to trading. Zeno did something different. He wandered into a bookshop, and there, on a shelf, he found a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, an account of the life and teachings of Socrates. He started reading, and something happened. Something clicked. The stories of Socrates, a man who valued wisdom over wealth, who chose death over compromise, who spent his life questioning everything, landed on Zeno like a wave far more powerful than the one that sank his ship. He turned to the bookseller and asked a question that would change the course of Western civilization. Where can I find men like this? At that exact moment, and this is one of those details that feels too perfect to be true, but the ancient sources insist it happened. The cynic philosopher Crates of Thebes was walking past the shop. The bookseller pointed at him and said, "Follow that man." Zeno did. He studied under Crates, then under the philosopher Stilpo, then under Polemo at the academy. For years he absorbed everything: cynic boldness, Megarian logic, academic skepticism. And then, around 300 BC, he began teaching his own synthesis of these ideas. He didn't rent a building. He didn't establish a formal school. He simply began holding discussions at the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, a covered walkway in the Athenian marketplace, decorated with murals of famous battles. His students became known as the people of the Stoa, Stoics, and the philosophy he taught there, that virtue is the only true good, that external circumstances are indifferent, that we should focus on what we can control and accept what we cannot, would become one of the most influential systems of thought in human history, practiced by slaves and emperors alike, the direct ancestor of cognitive behavioral therapy, the philosophical foundation that held the Roman Empire together, a living tradition that 2,300 years later still helps millions of people get through the day. All because a ship sank. Later in life, someone asked Zeno about his fortune, the one lost at sea, and Zeno smiled and said, "I made my most prosperous voyage when I was shipwrecked." Think about that. The worst thing that ever happened to him was the best thing that ever happened to him. He just couldn't see it at the time. And here's why this matters to you. Job loss, divorce, financial ruin, a health crisis, the death of someone you love, a plan that falls apart, a dream that dies. These feel like endings. They feel like the world is telling you, it's over. Go home. Give up. But Zeno's story, and the entire philosophical tradition it birthed, says something else. It says, every ending contains a beginning. Every destruction carries the seed of creation. The life you build from the wreckage might be infinitely more valuable than the one that went down with the ship. You just can't see it yet. Zeno turned disaster into philosophy. The next thinker went even deeper, into the darkest corners of his own mind. And what he found there changed how we understand what it means to be human. Every self-help book in the world tells you the same thing. Focus on the light. Think positive. Visualize success. Manifest your best self. Carl Jung said that's exactly how you stay unconscious. Jung was, for a time, the crown prince of modern psychology, Sigmund Freud's chosen heir, the man Freud had handpicked to carry psychoanalysis into the future. They were close, intellectually intimate in a way that few scientists ever are. Freud called Jung my successor and crown prince, and then Jung destroyed all of it. In 1912, after years of growing disagreement, Jung published a book that directly challenged Freud's core ideas. He argued that the unconscious wasn't just a dumping ground for repressed sexual urges. It was a vast, ancient, collective reservoir of shared human experience. Myths, symbols, archetypes that show up in every culture, every era, every human mind. Freud was furious. The break was brutal, professional, intellectual, and deeply personal. Jung lost his mentor, his professional network, and his standing in the psychoanalytic community all at once. But that wasn't the dark part. The dark part was what came next. Starting in late 1913, Jung deliberately plunged into what he later called a confrontation with the unconscious. And I need you to understand what that means, because it wasn't meditation, it wasn't journaling, it wasn't therapy. Jung induced visions. He sat in his study, closed his eyes, and allowed images and figures to emerge from the depths of his mind. He then engaged these figures in conversation. He asked them questions. He argued with them. He followed them into landscapes that felt as real as the physical world. He met a figure he called Philemon, an old man with kingfisher wings who became a kind of inner guru. He met Salome, a blind woman who represented his emotional self. He encountered what he called the shadow, the dark, rejected, denied aspects of his own personality that he'd spent his conscious life avoiding. And then came the dream that nearly broke him. In one of his most disturbing visions, Jung dreamed that he murdered the hero Siegfried, the great figure of Germanic mythology, the symbol of will and power. He killed the hero with a rifle in the mountains. When he woke up, he was weeping. He understood with a shock of recognition that the dream was telling him to kill the hero within himself, the part of him that wanted to be strong, admired, invincible, the part that served the ego rather than truth. Jung had to destroy his own self-image to find what was underneath. This wasn't comfortable psychology. This was a man voluntarily descending into his own madness. For nearly 6 years, 1913 to 1917, with echoes continuing through 1919, Jung existed in a state that his biographers describe as bordering on psychosis. He heard voices. He saw things that weren't there. His family worried. His colleagues worried. He kept seeing patients during the day, performing his professional duties, and then, at night, he went back down. And he recorded everything. In a massive red leather-bound book, Jung wrote and painted his experiences. Beautiful, terrifying calligraphy, elaborate mandala paintings, mythological scenes rendered with medieval precision. This became the Red Book, Liber Novus. And it is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary documents ever created by a human mind. Jung never published it. After his death in 1961, his family locked it in a Swiss bank vault. For nearly 50 years, the most important unpublished work in psychology sat in the dark, unseen. In 2009, it was finally published. The art world, the psychology world, and the general public were stunned. It became a sensation. This was the raw, unfiltered material from which all of Jung's later ideas emerged. The collective, unconscious, archetypes, the shadow, individuation, synchronicity. Every concept that made Jung one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century had its roots in that terrifying descent. One does not become enlightened, Jung wrote, by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That single sentence overturns everything modern culture teaches about self-improvement. We're told to be positive, to avoid negative thoughts, to surround ourselves with light and love and good vibes. Jung says, you're running from the very thing that could make you whole. Everyone has a shadow. The anger you suppress, the ambitions you deny, the desires you're ashamed of, the parts of yourself you've locked away because they don't fit the image you present to the world. Jung's message is this: those rejected parts don't disappear just because you refuse to look at them. They run your life from the basement. They sabotage your relationships, derail your goals, and surface in moments of crisis as the worst version of yourself. The only way out is through. Not around the darkness, through it, into it, meeting it face to face, the way Jung met Philemon and Salome, and the shadow in that red leather book. Acknowledging the parts of yourself you'd rather deny. That's where wholeness lives. Not in the light alone, but in the integration of light and dark. For anyone lying in the dark right now, wondering why you feel the way you feel, why certain patterns keep repeating, why the same problems follow you no matter what you change on the outside, Jung would say, the answer isn't out there. It's in here, in the shadows you haven't looked at yet. And the moment you turn to face them, they begin to lose their power. Jung dove into his own darkness. The next story is about a man who simply walked away from everything, and in doing so left behind one of the most profound texts in human history. In a world that worships hustle, that celebrates grinding harder, optimizing more, sleeping less, achieving constantly, the wisest man in ancient China taught that the highest form of action is doing nothing at all. His name was Lao Tzu, and honestly, we're not even sure he existed. That's not a joke. Scholars have debated for centuries whether Lao Tzu was a real person or a composite figure, a name attached to a collection of ancient wisdom. But the traditional story, the one told by the historian Sima Qian around 100 BC, is too beautiful not to share, and even if it's partly legend, the lesson is as real as anything in this video. According to tradition, Lao Tzu worked as the keeper of the archives in the royal court of the Zhou dynasty. A librarian, basically. While emperors rose and fell, while armies clashed and borders shifted, while the entire civilization churned with ambition and violence, there was this quiet man in the back room, organizing scrolls. And there's a story about a visit. A young Confucius, already famous for his teachings on ethics, propriety, and social harmony, traveled to the capital to meet the legendary archivist. He wanted to discuss ritual and proper conduct. He wanted to be seen meeting the great Lao Tzu. The meeting did not go as Confucius expected. Lao Tzu looked at the young teacher and said something devastating. He told Confucius to rid himself of his arrogance and his many desires. He said that all of Confucius's talk of propriety and ritual was just noise, a mask over the true nature of things. Confucius went home and said nothing for 3 days. When his students finally asked what had happened, he said, "Today, I have seen Lao Tzu, and I can only compare him to a dragon. Rising on the wind and clouds to the heavens, he is beyond my understanding." A dragon, the highest compliment in Chinese culture. And from Confucius, no less. A man who didn't hand out compliments lightly. But the part of Lao Tzu's story that stays with me is the ending. Watching the Zhou dynasty crumble, watching the court descend into corruption, watching the values he cherished fade away, Lao Tzu decided to leave, not to protest, not to reform, not to start a revolution. He simply decided it was time to go. He mounted a water buffalo and headed west, toward the frontier, toward the edge of the civilized world. At the Hangu Pass, the last checkpoint before the Untamed Mountains, a gatekeeper named Yin Shi recognized him. Now, accounts differ on how Yin Shi knew who he was. Perhaps the old man was famous. Perhaps there was something about him that you simply couldn't miss. Either way, the gatekeeper stopped him and made a request. "You are about to disappear from the world," Yin Shi said. "Please, before you go, write down your wisdom." And Lao Tzu, this quiet, reluctant sage, sat down and wrote. 5,000 characters, 81 short chapters, a text so compressed and crystalline that scholars have been unpacking it for 2,500 years. The Tao Te Ching. When he finished, he handed the manuscript to Yin Shi, passed through the gate, and walked into the mountains. He was never seen again. Nobody knows where he went. Nobody knows when or where he died. He simply vanished into the mist and the mountains and the silence. And the text he left behind? It became the second most translated work in human history, after the Bible. Billions of people have read it. Entire religions, philosophies, and martial arts traditions have been built on its principles. At its heart is one idea, Wu Wei. It's usually translated as non-action or effortless action, but that doesn't quite capture it. Wu Wei isn't laziness. It isn't passivity. It's alignment. It's the difference between forcing a river to change course and simply flowing with it. The Tao does nothing, Lao Tzu wrote, yet through it all things are done. Water doesn't fight the rock. It flows around it. And given enough time, the water wears the rock away. The tree that bends survives the storm. The one that stands rigid snaps. Here's why this matters tonight. How many of you are lying there right now, exhausted? Not just physically tired, but soul tired. Tired of pushing. Tired of striving. Tired of the endless pressure to do more. Be more. Achieve more. Tired of the voice in your head that says you're not doing enough. Lao Tzu has a message for you, and it's going to sound strange in a world that celebrates hustle culture and productivity hacks and grinding until you drop. The message is stop. Not forever, not permanently, but right now, in this moment, stop trying so hard, stop forcing, stop gripping. The harder you hold on, the more slips through your fingers. The more desperately you chase happiness, the faster it runs away. The solution isn't more effort. Sometimes the solution is less. Let go, like Lao Tzu let go of the court, the city, the civilization that no longer served truth, like he let go of his own name, his own story, his own identity, walking through that gate and into the unknown. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Lao Tzu taught us to let go. The next philosopher took that lesson even further. He let go of his fear of death itself, and the way he did it was by rehearsing his own death every single day. He spent his entire life rehearsing his own death, and when the day finally came, he was ready. His name was Seneca, Lucius Annaeus Seneca. And he was one of the most fascinating, contradictory, and ultimately heroic figures in all of Roman history. See, Seneca was rich, incredibly rich. One of the wealthiest men in Rome. He owned estates across the empire, had a private fortune that would make modern billionaires blink, and moved in the highest circles of power. And his critics never let him forget it. How can you call yourself a Stoic, they said, when you live like a king? How can you preach simplicity when you dine on gold plates? How can you write about the meaninglessness of wealth while accumulating mountains of it? It's a fair question, and Seneca had a fair answer. He said that wealth isn't the problem. Attachment to wealth is. He could enjoy luxury without depending on it. He could have everything and be willing to lose everything at a moment's notice. But words are easy. The proof, that comes at the end. Seneca was born around 4 BC in Córdoba, Spain. He was educated in Rome became a brilliant orator and writer, and rose to prominence as one of the leading intellectuals of his time. But his career was a roller coaster. Emperor Claudius exiled him to the island of Corsica in 41 AD. The official charge was adultery. Almost certainly a political pretext. For 8 years, Seneca lived on a barren, windswept island in the Mediterranean. During that exile, his father died, his first wife died, his young son died. And what did Seneca do? He wrote a letter of consolation to his mother, telling her not to grieve for him, comforting the person who should have been comforting him. The letter Ad Helviam Matrum is one of the most extraordinary pieces of Stoic writing ever produced. When Claudius's wife, Agrippina, recalled Seneca from exile in 49 AD, it was to tutor her young son. That son's name was Nero. For the next several years, Seneca was essentially the co-ruler of Rome. He and the Praetorian prefect Burrus guided the young emperor, and under their influence, Nero's early reign was remarkably peaceful and competent. Historians call these years the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years. But Nero was Nero, and eventually the monster emerged. Nero murdered his own mother Agrippina. He kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death. He became increasingly erratic, cruel, and paranoid. Seneca tried to retire from public life, tried to distance himself from the growing horror. But Nero wouldn't let him go, and in 65 AD, when a conspiracy against Nero was uncovered, the famous Pisonian plot, Seneca was accused of involvement. Whether he was actually part of the plot is still debated. It doesn't matter. Nero sent centurions to deliver the death sentence. And now we see what Seneca had been practicing for. The account comes from the Roman historian Tacitus in his Annals, Book 15. It's one of the most detailed death scenes in ancient literature, and it reads like a man who has been rehearsing this moment his entire life. The centurions arrived. Seneca received them without panic. He turned to his friends who were weeping and said, "Where are your philosophical precepts? Where is the preparation of so many years against evils to come?" His young wife, Paulina, declared that she would die with him. She insisted. Seneca tried to dissuade her, but she was resolved. They opened the veins in their arms together. But Seneca was old. His blood flowed too slowly. He severed the veins in his ankles and behind his knees. Still too slow. He asked for hemlock, the poison that killed Socrates, and drank it. Still his body held on. Finally, he was carried to a warm bath. The steam and heat accelerated the bleeding, and as the water reddened around him, Seneca dictated his final philosophical thoughts to scribes. He died thinking. He died teaching. He died prepared. Because here's the thing. Every single day for decades, Seneca had practiced premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Every evening, he mentally rehearsed the worst things that could happen to him. Losing his wealth, losing his health, losing his loved ones, losing his life. He would sit with the fear, hold it in his mind, turn it over, examine it from every angle, not to be morbid, not to be pessimistic, but to drain the fear of its power. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality, he wrote, and he meant it literally. The anticipation of pain is almost always worse than the pain itself. The meeting you've been dreading for weeks takes 20 minutes and isn't that bad. The diagnosis you feared turns out to be treatable. The conversation you've been avoiding leads to resolution, not disaster. 90% of what you fear will never happen. And the 10% that does, it's rarely as devastating as your mind made it. Your imagination is crueler than reality. Your anxiety is a worse torturer than any actual event. Seneca's solution was elegant. Face the worst case in advance. Every day. Mentally walk through the loss, the failure, the humiliation, the death. Not to invite these things, but to remove their sting. When you've already imagined losing everything, losing something doesn't destroy you. And when the absolute worst came, when the centurion stood at his door with a death sentence from a mad emperor, Seneca was calm. He'd been practicing for this moment his entire adult life. Here's the application for you. Tonight, lying in the dark. What are you afraid of right now? What scenario keeps playing in your mind, keeping you awake? What conversation are you avoiding? What diagnosis are you dreading? What loss are you terrified of? Face it, right now. In your mind, walk through it, see it clearly, feel the worst of it, and then notice. It's not as bad as the fog of fear made it seem. The thing itself is almost never as terrible as the imagined version. Seneca proved that with his life and his death. Seneca faced the ultimate test with calm because he'd been practicing his whole life. But our next story is about a man who was stripped down to nothing by life, not by choice, and found something even more unexpected. Because sometimes the suffering you never asked for becomes the very thing that qualifies you for greatness. His friends hid the knives. That's not a metaphor. Abraham Lincoln's depression was so severe, so visible, so alarming, that the people closest to him organized informal suicide watches. They literally removed sharp objects from his reach during his worst episodes. In 1835, after the death of Anne Rutledge, a young woman many historians believe was his first love, Lincoln collapsed. He couldn't work. He couldn't function. His neighbors in New Salem, Illinois, watched a man come apart. They hid every blade, every razor, every instrument that might be used for self-harm. In 1841, he suffered another breakdown, so catastrophic that he missed sessions of the Illinois legislature. His friend Joshua Speed wrote that Lincoln was so overcome with depression that he could barely speak. Speed stayed with him for weeks, afraid to leave him alone. And this was the man who would hold the United States together during the most devastating crisis in its history. Lincoln failed at almost everything before he succeeded at the thing that mattered most. He failed in business. He lost election after election, state legislature, Congress, Senate. His personal life was marked by extraordinary suffering. His son Eddie died at age 3. His son Willie died at age 11 in the White House during the Civil War. His marriage to Mary Todd was, by most accounts, deeply difficult. And yet, this man, who fought every single day just to find a reason to keep living, became the president who abolished slavery, preserved the Union, and delivered the Gettysburg Address. He did this not despite his depression, but in a strange and profound way, because of it. Lincoln's lifelong suffering gave him something that no amount of confidence or optimism could provide: empathy, a bone-deep understanding of pain. When he looked at enslaved people, he didn't see a political issue. He saw human beings in agony. When he looked at soldiers dying on battlefields, he didn't see statistics. He saw sons and fathers and brothers. "I have been driven many times upon my knees," Lincoln said, "by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go." That's not weakness talking. That's the most honest thing any leader has ever said. He was driven to his knees. He had nowhere else to go. And from that place of absolute vulnerability, he found the strength to lead. Here's what Lincoln teaches us. In a culture that celebrates confidence and positivity, and crushing it, where admitting to struggle is seen as weakness, where vulnerability is something to hide, Lincoln's life is a radical counter-narrative. Your suffering is not your disqualification. It might be your greatest qualification. The things that are breaking you right now, the grief, the anxiety, the depression, the sense that you're not enough, those things are building something in you. Empathy, depth, resilience, a capacity for compassion that comfortable people simply don't possess. Lincoln knew this. He lived it every day of his presidency. The saddest man in America led the nation through its darkest hour, because he was the only one who truly understood what darkness felt like. You don't have to have it all together. You don't have to be confident. You don't have to pretend. The broken places are where the light gets in. Lincoln sat with his suffering. He let it teach him. But our next rule comes from a man who took the opposite approach. A man who charged through his pain with such velocity that he became one of the most dynamic forces in American history. Where Lincoln was still, this man was relentless, and both found their way to the other side. On February 14th, 1884, Valentine's Day, Theodore Roosevelt came home to find his life destroyed. At 3 o'clock in the morning, his mother, Mitty, died of typhoid fever. Then, 11 hours later, in the same house, on the same day, his wife, Alice Lee, died of undiagnosed kidney failure. She was 22 years old. She'd given birth to their first child just 2 days earlier. Roosevelt was 25. In his diary that night, he drew a single large X across the page. Beneath it, he wrote 4 words: "The light has gone out of my life." He never spoke of Alice publicly again, not once. For the rest of his life, she was a silence, a gap, a door permanently closed. He left his newborn daughter with his sister, and he fled. He went to the Badlands of North Dakota, the most remote, desolate place he could find. For 2 years, he ranched cattle, hunted buffalo, chased horse thieves through blizzards, and physically rebuilt himself from the wreckage of his grief. When he returned to New York, he was a different man. The thin, bookish, asthmatic young aristocrat was gone. In his place was, well, a force of nature. Roosevelt became the most energetic human being in American public life. Police Commissioner of New York City, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, leader of the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, charging up San Juan Hill under enemy fire, governor of New York, vice president. And then, when President McKinley was assassinated in 1901, the youngest president in American history at 42. He busted monopolies, he built the Panama Canal, he established the National Park System, protecting 230 million acres of American wilderness. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. He read a book a day, sometimes two. He boxed in the White House until a blow detached his retina. He then switched to jiu-jitsu. And in 1912, while campaigning for president, he was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin. The bullet was slowed by his steel eyeglasses case, and the 50-page speech folded in his breast pocket. Roosevelt looked down at the hole in his chest, coughed into his hand, saw no blood, and concluded the bullet hadn't pierced his lung. Then he gave the speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot." He spoke for 90 minutes, with a bullet in his chest. Now here's the thing about Roosevelt. His famous speech at the Sorbonne in 1910, the Man in the Arena speech, isn't just rhetoric. It's autobiography. "It is not the critic who counts," he said, "not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena." Roosevelt didn't come up with that philosophy in a library. He forged it in the Badlands, running from a grief so enormous that he literally had to outrun it across the American frontier. His relentless drive, the boxing, the charging, the never-stop-moving energy, wasn't born from natural optimism or privilege. It was a man running from pain. And in that running, he transformed himself into something extraordinary. The lesson? Get in the arena. Stop watching from the sidelines. Stop analyzing, criticizing, waiting for the perfect moment. The perfect moment doesn't exist. There's only now, and the willingness to act despite the fear, despite the grief, despite the bullet lodged in your chest. It's not the critic who counts. It's you. In the arena. Bloody, dusty, and still standing. Roosevelt ran from grief into action. He chose the arena over the armchair. But 25 centuries before him, a young prince made a different choice. He walked out of the most comfortable life imaginable and into the most uncomfortable truth he could find. Because sometimes the arena isn't out there. It's inside the palace walls you've built around yourself. He had everything. Wealth, a palace, a beautiful wife, a newborn son, servants, gardens, music, every pleasure the ancient world could offer. And one night, at the age of 29, he looked at all of it and walked out the door. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. The world would come to know him as the Buddha. Siddhartha was born a prince of the Shakya clan in what is now Nepal, around 563 BC. Before his birth, a seer told his father, King Suddhodana, that the boy would either become a great king or a great spiritual leader. Suddhodana was determined it would be the former. So he built a cage, the most beautiful cage in the world. Siddhartha was raised inside the palace walls. He was surrounded by youth, beauty, music, luxury. The old, the sick, and the dying were kept far away. He never saw poverty. He never saw suffering. He never saw death. His entire existence was engineered to be perfect. And for 29 years, it worked. Then came the 4 sights. On 4 separate journeys outside the palace walls, whether by accident or by fate, depending on which tradition you follow, Siddhartha encountered the truths his father had hidden from him. He saw an old man, bent and trembling. He'd never seen old age before. "What happened to him?" he asked his charioteer. "That happens to everyone," came the reply. "It will happen to you." He saw a sick man, writhing in pain. He'd never seen disease. The charioteer told him, "This can happen to anyone, at any time. No one is immune." He saw a corpse being carried to the cremation grounds. He'd never seen death. The charioteer said, "This is the end of every life. No one escapes it." And then he saw a wandering ascetic, a man with a shaved head and simple robes, walking calmly through the chaos of the world with a look of absolute peace on his face. "Who is that?" Siddhartha asked. "That is a man who has renounced the world to seek truth," the charioteer answered. That night, Siddhartha looked at his sleeping wife and his newborn son. He looked at the palace, the gardens, the silk, the gold, and he understood, with the force of a revelation, that none of it could protect him. Not from aging, not from sickness, not from death, not from the fundamental suffering that lives at the heart of human existence. He left. He walked out of the palace in the middle of the night, leaving behind his kingdom, his wife, his child, and everything he'd ever known. He cut off his hair with a sword. He exchanged his royal robes for a beggar's rags, and he began searching for the answer to a single question. Why do human beings suffer, and is there a way to end it? For 6 years, he wandered. He studied under the greatest teachers in India. He practiced extreme asceticism, fasting until his spine was visible through his stomach, sitting in the blazing sun, denying himself every comfort. He nearly died. And then he realized something. Extreme denial was just the flip side of extreme indulgence. Both were prisons. The answer wasn't at either extreme. It was in the middle. He sat down beneath a fig tree, later known as the Bodhi tree, in Bodh Gaya, and vowed not to rise until he had found the answer. For 49 days he sat. Temptations came, doubts came, fear came, and on the 49th day, he awakened. The middle way, the path between indulgence and deprivation, the 4 noble truths. Suffering exists. Suffering has a cause, craving. Suffering can end, and there is a path to its end. The Eightfold Path. Right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. For the next 45 years, the Buddha taught. He never returned to his kingdom. He never reclaimed his throne. He walked barefoot across India, teaching anyone who would listen, rich and poor, high caste and low caste, men and women. Comfort is the enemy of awakening. That's the lesson of the 4 sights. You cannot wake up inside a pleasure palace. The beautiful cage your father built, the comfortable life, the predictable routine, the endless stream of entertainment and distraction keeps you asleep, and you will remain asleep until something breaks through the walls. Old age? Sickness? Death? loss. Here's why this matters right now. How many of us are living inside our own version of Siddhartha's palace? Surrounded by screens and subscriptions and same-day delivery. Buffered from discomfort by 1,000 small conveniences. Never bored, never still, never truly confronting the questions that matter most. The Buddha's story isn't about rejecting comfort. It's about recognizing that comfort, when it becomes your entire world, is a form of sleep. And the things that wake you up, the hard truths, the painful revelations, the moments that crack the walls of your palace, those aren't punishments. They're invitations. Every difficulty you face is a crack in the wall, and through that crack, the real world comes flooding in. Don't run from it. Walk through it. Like Siddhartha walked through the gate. Like he sat under that tree and refused to move until the truth revealed itself. The answers are on the other side of your comfort zone. They always have been. The Buddha left his palace to confront reality. Our next story is about a woman who was never given a palace in the first place, who was told she couldn't even enter the building, and who confronted reality so directly, so fearlessly that it eventually killed her. And she would do it all again. She was denied everything, and she took everything anyway. Maria Sklodowska was born in Warsaw, Poland, in 1867, under Russian occupation. As a woman in the Russian Empire, she was forbidden from attending university. Let me say that again. Forbidden. Not discouraged. Not, it's unusual, literally barred by law from pursuing higher education because of her gender. So she made a deal with her sister Bronislava. Marie would work as a governess for years, sending money to fund Bronislava's medical studies in Paris. Then, Bronislava would return the favor. Marie kept her end of the bargain. For 5 years, she worked in other people's homes, teaching other people's children, saving every kopeck. And in 1891, at the age of 24, she finally arrived in Paris. She was nearly penniless. She rented a tiny attic room in the Latin Quarter, freezing in winter, boiling in summer. She survived on buttered bread and chocolate. She studied physics at the Sorbonne, while sometimes fainting from hunger because she couldn't afford enough food. One account says she sometimes ate nothing but radishes and cherries for days. She graduated first in her physics degree in 1893. Then second in her mathematics degree in 1894. The woman who wasn't allowed to attend university outperformed every man in the room. Then she met Pierre Curie, and their partnership became one of the great love stories in the history of science. Together working in a converted shed with a leaking roof and a dirt floor, a space one visiting chemist described as something between a stable and a potato cellar, they made one of the most important discoveries in scientific history. They found 2 new elements, polonium, named after Marie's homeland, and radium. The work was brutal. They processed tons of pitch-blende ore by hand, literally shoveling, grinding, and boiling huge vats of mineral waste to isolate tiny traces of radioactive material. Marie stirred the cauldrons with an iron rod nearly as tall as she was, for hours at a time, in a shed that had no proper ventilation. And here's the detail that haunts. Marie and Pierre kept vials of radium by their bedside, because the blue-green glow was beautiful. They thought it was beautiful. They would lie in bed at night, and watch their discovery shimmer in the darkness. They didn't understand what it was doing to them. Marie carried test tubes of radioactive isotopes in her pockets. She stored them in her desk drawers. Pierre deliberately burned his arm with radium to observe the effects on human tissue. Neither of them understood that the beautiful blue glow was killing them, slowly, from the inside out. In 1903, Marie became the first woman to win the Nobel Prize, in physics shared with Pierre and Henri Becquerel. In 1911, she won a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry alone. She remains the only person in history to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences. But the French Academy of Sciences refused to admit her as a member. By 2 votes, because she was a woman, and because she was Polish, and because a public scandal over an affair with a married physicist had made her a target for the xenophobic French press, who called her a Polish homewrecker. She went to Stockholm to accept her second Nobel Prize anyway. The Nobel Committee had asked her not to come. She went anyway. When World War I broke out, Marie didn't retreat to her laboratory. She invented mobile X-ray units, small trucks equipped with X-ray machines, and drove them to the front lines herself. She learned to drive. She learned anatomy. She trained other women as X-ray operators. An estimated 1 million wounded soldiers were examined with her Petite Curie. She tried to donate her gold Nobel Prize medals to the war effort. The French National Bank refused to melt them down. Marie Curie died on July 4, 1934, of aplastic anemia, her bone marrow destroyed by decades of radiation exposure. The beautiful blue glow had been killing her all along. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Her personal papers, her notebooks, even her cookbook, are still radioactive. More than 90 years later, they're stored in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. If you want to see them, you have to sign a liability waiver and wear protective clothing. The woman who said, "Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood," was killed by the very thing she was trying to understand. She never feared radiation because she was too busy studying it. Her curiosity was absolute. It was also ultimately fatal. "Now is the time to understand more," she wrote, "so that we may fear less." That sentence is her entire life, compressed into 14 words. Here's what Marie Curie teaches us. Fear is a liar. It tells you that understanding is dangerous, that ignorance is safer, that the unknown should be avoided. Curie's life proves the opposite. Understanding is always better than ignorance. Even when the understanding comes at a cost, she would rather know and die than not know and live in safety. For anyone lying awake with fear tonight, fear of a diagnosis, fear of a conversation, fear of the unknown, Curie's message is this: turn toward it, study it, understand it. The thing you fear loses most of its power the moment you look at it directly. Fear thrives in darkness. Understanding is light. Curie turned toward what terrified everyone else and tried to understand it. But sometimes the thing you need to understand isn't out there in the world. It's in here, in the grief, in the loss, in the wound that won't stop bleeding. Our next story is about a man who discovered that the deepest understanding comes not from studying the universe, but from letting the universe shatter you. He was a scholar, respectable, conventional, the kind of man who followed the rules, kept his head down, and built a quiet, dignified career. And then he met someone who set his entire world on fire. Jalal-ad-Din Muhammad Balkhi, known in the West as Rumi, was born in 1207 in what is now Afghanistan or Tajikistan. His family fled the Mongol invasions when he was a child, eventually settling in Konya, in modern-day Turkey. By his 30s, Rumi had become exactly what his father and teachers expected: a respected Islamic scholar, a jurist, a preacher. He taught hundreds of students. He followed the established path. Then, on November 15th, 1244, a wandering mystic named Shamsi Tabrizi walked into Konya. The story of their meeting has been told 1,000 ways. In one version, Shams asked Rumi a question so profound that Rumi fainted on the spot. In another, Shams threw Rumi's books into a fountain and said, "Now you must live what you have been reading." In every version, the result is the same. Rumi's entire world cracked open. For months, Rumi and Shams were inseparable. They talked for hours, for days. Rumi abandoned his teaching duties, his students, his social obligations. He spent all his time with this strange, provocative, wild mystic who challenged everything he thought he knew. His students were furious. His family was alarmed. Who was this stranger who had stolen their master? What kind of hold did he have? And then Shams vanished. The first time, he left of his own accord. Rumi was devastated. He sent his son Sultan Walad to find Shams and bring him back. Walad found him in Damascus, and Shams returned. The second time, Shams disappeared forever. The circumstances are murky, but many historians believe he was murdered, possibly by Rumi's own students, who saw Shams as a dangerous intruder who had corrupted their master. Rumi was destroyed. He searched everywhere. He traveled to Damascus multiple times, walking the streets, asking strangers, calling Shams' name. He couldn't eat. He couldn't teach. He couldn't function. And then something shifted. Rumi stopped looking for Shams in the world. He started looking for Shams inside himself. And what he found there was everything. The grief cracked him open, and through the crack, poetry poured out. Not the careful, scholarly verse of a trained academic. Something else entirely. Wild, ecstatic, heartbroken, transcendent poetry that felt as though it was being channeled from somewhere beyond the human mind. Over the remaining 3 decades of his life, Rumi composed more than 65,000 verses. The Masnavi, a 6-book epic poem of over 25,000 verses, was so revered that it became known as the Quran in Persian. The Divan-i-Shamsi Tabrizi, the collected works dedicated to his lost beloved, contains some of the most beautiful love poetry ever written in any language. The wound is the place where the light enters you. That's not a metaphor for Rumi. It's a description of what happened to him. The wound of losing Shams was the crack through which his true genius entered the world. Before Shams, Rumi was a competent scholar. After Shams, after the loss, the grief, the shattering, he became one of the greatest poets in human history. 8 centuries later, Rumi is the best-selling poet in the United States. In the 21st century, a 13th century Sufi mystic, outselling every living poet in America. That's how deep his words go. That's how universal his grief was. Here's the lesson for tonight. The wound is not the enemy. The wound is the opening. The grief, the loss, the heartbreak that feels like it's going to destroy you. It might be the very thing that cracks you open to something greater than you've ever known. Rumi didn't become a poet, despite losing Shams. He became a poet because he lost Shams. The loss was the doorway. The pain was the price of admission. And what came through that door was beauty that has illuminated 800 years of human darkness. Whatever wound you're carrying tonight, don't rush to close it. Don't numb it. Don't run from it. It might be the place where the light enters you. Rumi was cracked open by loss, and what poured out was poetry. But what about the person you've never forgiven? Yourself? What about the voice inside that says you're not enough, that your instincts are wrong, that you should listen to everyone else instead? Our next story is about a man who lost everything. His wife, his son, his faith, and in the wreckage discovered that the only voice worth trusting was his own. He opened his first wife's coffin. 14 months after Ellen Tucker Emerson died of tuberculosis at the age of 19, 14 months after Ralph Waldo Emerson lost the love of his young life, he went to her tomb and opened the coffin. He wrote about it in his journal. A single line, matter of fact, almost clinical. We don't know why. Grief does strange things to people. But I think he needed to see. He needed to look at the reality of loss and not look away. He needed to make it real in a way that words and memories couldn't. Because Ralph Waldo Emerson, the man who would become the father of American self-reliance, the philosopher who taught an entire nation to trust itself, was built on loss, layer upon layer of it. His father died when he was 8, leaving the family in poverty. His mother took in boarders to survive. Young Waldo shared a winter coat with his brother because they could only afford one. He went to Harvard, but as a scholarship student serving meals to wealthier classmates to pay his way. He became a Unitarian minister. He married Ellen. She was beautiful, brilliant, and dying of tuberculosis from the moment they met. They had 18 months together. 18 months of happiness in a life that would be defined by its absences. After her death, Emerson resigned from the ministry. He couldn't give communion anymore. He couldn't perform the rituals with sincerity. Something in him had broken. Or rather, something had broken open. The conventional beliefs that had sustained him felt hollow now. He needed something more honest, something real. He traveled to Europe. He met Thomas Carlyle, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth. He came home and began writing. And what he wrote changed America. Self-Reliance was published in 1841. It is, in many ways, the founding document of American individualism. The essay that said, "Trust yourself. Think for yourself. Don't conform to the expectations of society, the church, the government, your family, your past self." Every great soul has been a nonconformist. Every moment of genius requires the courage to say something that nobody else is saying. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. But Emerson's self-reliance wasn't born from confidence. That's the part most people miss. It wasn't optimism or American can-do spirit. It was survival. Because in 1842 the worst blow fell. His 5-year-old son Waldo, named after himself, the center of his entire universe, died of scarlet fever. Emerson was annihilated. He wrote about it in one of his most honest and devastating essays, Experience. In the death of my son, now more than 2 years ago, I seem to have lost a beautiful estate. No more! I cannot get it nearer to me. Read that carefully. He's saying he can't feel it. The grief is so enormous that it has gone beyond feeling into a kind of numbness. He knows the loss is catastrophic. He knows it should destroy him. But the emotional reality of it keeps slipping away, like trying to hold water in your hands. That numbness, that terrifying inability to feel the very thing that should feel worst, became the raw material for his deepest philosophy. If the external world can be taken away at any moment, if the people you love most can vanish overnight, then the only reliable foundation is inside you. Self-reliance wasn't Emerson's first choice. It was his last resort. And that's what makes it so powerful. He isn't saying trust yourself because you're wonderful. He's saying trust yourself because everything else will let you down. The world is unreliable. People die. Love ends. Institutions fail. The only constant is what's inside you. Your own perception, your own truth, your own unshakable core. Emerson's influence is almost impossible to overstate. Henry David Thoreau went to Walden Pond because of Emerson. Walt Whitman wrote Leaves of Grass because of Emerson. Friedrich Nietzsche was profoundly influenced by him. Every self-help book, every motivational speech, every follow your passion Instagram post traces its lineage, whether it knows it or not, back to a grieving minister in Concord, Massachusetts, who lost everything and decided that the only trustworthy thing in the universe was the voice inside his own chest. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else, he wrote, is the greatest accomplishment. Here's the application for tonight. How much of your life is built on other people's expectations? Your parents' dreams for you, your partner's vision of who you should be, your employer's requirements, society's definition of success, the algorithm's version of your interests. When was the last time you asked yourself, what do I actually believe? Not what am I supposed to believe, not what does everyone around me believe. What do I, in the quietest, most honest part of myself, actually know to be true? Emerson says that voice is there. It's always been there. You've just been drowning it out with other people's noise. Trust yourself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string, yours included. Emerson trusted himself when every external support collapsed. But what if you never had those supports to begin with? What if the world barred you from the very institutions that were supposed to teach you who to be? Our next rule comes from someone who was locked out of every door and built a civilization through the windows. The greatest genius in the history of Western civilization couldn't read Latin, couldn't do long division, had no formal education beyond basic reading and writing, was illegitimate, gay, left-handed, vegetarian, and dressed in outfits so flamboyant they shocked 15th century Florence, which is really saying something. His name was Leonardo da Vinci, and everything about him was impossible. Leonardo was born in 1452, the illegitimate son of a Florentine notary named Ser Piero and a peasant woman named Caterina. In Renaissance Italy, illegitimacy was a devastating social handicap. It barred him from university. It barred him from his father's profession of law. It barred him from virtually every guild and professional organization that controlled Florentine life. He called himself Homo Senza Lettere, a man without letters, an unschooled man, a nobody. And here is the counterintuitive twist that makes Leonardo's story one of the most important in this entire video. Being excluded from formal education may have been the best thing that ever happened to him. Think about it. While legitimate sons were being funneled into Latin grammar schools, learning by rote, memorizing the approved texts, absorbing the approved interpretations, Leonardo was free. Free to wander, free to observe, free to learn from the world itself rather than from books about the world. He watched water flow. He studied the way light fell on objects. He dissected corpses, over 30 human bodies, at a time when the church strictly forbade it. He spent decades observing the flight of birds, trying to decode the mathematics of wings. He drew everything, constantly, obsessively. His notebooks, over 7,000 pages survive, are filled with observations so precise and so far ahead of their time that modern scientists are still catching up. He was the first person to correctly draw the human skull from multiple angles, the first to describe arteriosclerosis, the first to study the anatomy of the human smile, mapping every nerve involved in that deceptively simple expression. He designed flying machines 400 years before the Wright brothers. He conceived of tanks, submarines, and solar energy concentrators. He drew plans for a self-propelled cart, essentially an early automobile. He designed a mechanical calculator, and he painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, two of the most famous artworks in human history. All of this from a man with no formal education. A man who learned everything he knew by looking at the world with an intensity that nobody had ever matched before, or has matched since. At 15, his father apprenticed him to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of Florence's leading artists. The famous story when young Leonardo painted an angel in the corner of Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ, the master was so stunned by his student's superiority that he supposedly put down his brush and never painted again. Whether that's strictly true or not, it captures something real. By his early 20s, Leonardo had surpassed every artist in Florence. By his 30s, he was the most versatile talent the world had ever seen. By the time he died in France in 1519, at the age of 67, he had filled those 7,000 notebook pages with ideas that would take centuries to be fully understood. And he wrote them all in mirror script, backwards, right to left. Whether this was to keep his ideas secret or simply because it was more natural for his left hand, nobody knows. Even his handwriting was impossible. Learning never exhausts the mind, Leonardo wrote, and he meant it literally. He was 70 years old and still studying the patterns of water flow, the same subject that had fascinated him since childhood. His curiosity was not a phase, it was not a hobby, it was the fundamental engine of his being. He could not stop learning any more than he could stop breathing. Here's why Leonardo's story matters tonight. We live in an age that worships credentials, degrees, certifications, the right school, the right program, the right piece of paper on the wall, and all of those things have value. But Leonardo proves something that the credential industrial complex doesn't want you to know. The most powerful form of learning is self-directed, driven by curiosity, following whatever fascinates you, wherever it leads for as long as it holds your attention. Leonardo learned from corpses and birds and rivers and light. He learned from failure. He left dozens of projects unfinished, including commissions for the Duke of Milan, the Pope, and the King of France. He learned from observation, not authority, and because he was never taught what was impossible, he kept trying things that everyone else assumed couldn't be done. The greatest genius in history had no degree, no credentials, no institutional approval. What he had was curiosity, relentless, omnivorous, inexhaustible curiosity. The same curiosity that you feel right now, every time something catches your attention and you think, I wonder how that works. I wonder why that happens. I wonder what would happen if I tried. That instinct, that pull toward understanding, is the same force that drove Leonardo. The same force that produced the Mona Lisa, the anatomical drawings, the flying machines, the 7,000 pages of mirror-written genius. Learning never exhausts the mind. It feeds it. It strengthens it. It keeps it alive. Follow the curiosity. Always follow the curiosity. It knows where it's going, even when you don't. Leonardo taught himself by looking at the world with impossible intensity. But 4 centuries later, another outsider, a man rejected by every institution that was supposed to recognize genius, would take that same curiosity and point it in a different direction. Not outward, at the visible world. Inward, at the invisible laws that hold reality together. And he did it, from a desk drawer. In 1905, the smartest man of the 20th century was a patent clerk, not a professor, not a researcher, not even a graduate student. A third-class technical examiner at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern, earning a modest salary, reviewing other people's inventions all day. His name was Albert Einstein. He was 26 years old, and the academic establishment had rejected him completely. Let me be specific about that rejection, because it matters. Einstein graduated from the Zurich Polytechnic in 1900. He applied for academic positions, rejected. He applied for teaching jobs at universities, rejected. He applied for a position as a high school teacher, rejected. His doctoral thesis was turned down. His academic advisor refused to give him a recommendation letter. By every institutional measure, every metric, every credential, every benchmark the scientific establishment used to identify promising talent, Albert Einstein was a failure. His friend's father pulled a string and got him the patent office job. Third class, the lowest level. His supervisor, Friedrich Haller, kept a sharp eye on him. Einstein was not allowed to pursue personal work during office hours, so he kept his physics in a drawer, literally. He had a drawer in his desk where he stashed sheets of paper covered in equations. When Haller wasn't looking, Einstein would pull them out and work on the problems that consumed him. He called that drawer, with a dry humor that tells you everything about his personality, his Department of Theoretical Physics. In 1904, his application for promotion from patent clerk third class to patent clerk second class was rejected. And then came 1905, over 4 months, from March to June. This rejected, overlooked, institutionally invisible 26-year-old patent clerk produced 4 papers that fundamentally rewrote the laws of physics. Physicists call it the Annus Mirabilis, the miracle year. There has never been anything like it in the history of science. There probably never will be again. The first paper explained the photoelectric effect. It proved that light behaves not just as a wave, but as discrete packets of energy, quanta. This laid the foundation for quantum physics and would eventually win Einstein the Nobel Prize. The second paper proved the existence of atoms. Atoms! The fundamental building blocks of matter, which many physicists in 1905 still treated as a useful fiction rather than physical reality. Einstein proved they were real by explaining why pollen grains jitter in water. Brownian motion. The third paper introduced special relativity. It demolished Isaac Newton's concepts of absolute space and absolute time, ideas that had been the bedrock of physics for over 200 years. Einstein showed that space and time are not fixed containers, but flexible dimensions that bend and stretch, depending on how fast you're moving. 200 years of certainty overturned by a patent clerk. The fourth paper contained the most famous equation in history, E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Mass and energy are the same thing, in different forms. This single equation would eventually lead to nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and a completely new understanding of the relationship between matter and the cosmos. 4 papers. 4 months. A desk drawer. A patent clerk. When a physicist named Johann Jakob Laub travelled from Würzburg to Bern in 1908 to study with Einstein, he was shocked to find the great man still working in the patent office. He called finding Einstein there one of history's bad jokes. Einstein didn't win the Nobel Prize until 1921, 16 years after the miracle year. And even then, it was awarded for the photoelectric effect, not for relativity. Special relativity was still considered too controversial for the Nobel Committee. They gave him the prize for his least revolutionary paper. Think about that for a moment. The Nobel Committee couldn't bring itself to award the prize for the work that actually changed everything. But here's what I want you to take from Einstein's story. It's not the physics, it's the lesson underneath. Imagination is more important than knowledge, Einstein said in a 1929 interview. For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. He wasn't being modest. He was being precise. Einstein didn't have a laboratory. He didn't have expensive equipment. He didn't have a research team or institutional support or even a decent job title. What he had was the ability to imagine things that nobody else could imagine. He could picture himself riding alongside a beam of light and asking what the world would look like from that perspective. He could visualize curved space-time before anyone had built a mathematical framework for it. He could hold paradoxes in his mind, 2 contradictory ideas simultaneously, and wait for the resolution to emerge. That's not knowledge, that's imagination, and it's more powerful than any credential, any institution, any amount of accumulated data. I have no special talent, Einstein once said. I am only passionately curious. Only passionately curious. As if that's a small thing. As if the ability to be genuinely, relentlessly, uncontrollably curious about how the world works isn't the rarest and most valuable quality a human being can possess. Here's why this matters to you. We live in a credentialing society. We're taught that the path to achievement runs through the right school, the right degree, the right job, the right connections, and sometimes it does. But Einstein's miracle year happened in a drawer, in a patent office, from a man the establishment had dismissed. Your best ideas might not come from your credentials. They might come from the thing you're passionate about, that nobody takes seriously, the hobby you pursue at 2 a.m., the question you keep turning over in your mind during boring meetings, the what-if that everyone else thinks is impractical. The establishment doesn't own genius. It never has. The most important work in human history was done by a rejected patent clerk with a hidden drawer and an imagination that wouldn't quit. What's in your drawer? What's the idea you've been hiding because nobody would take it seriously? What's the curiosity you've been suppressing because it doesn't fit your resume? Einstein says, that curiosity is your genius. That imagination is your superpower. Everything else, the credentials, the connections, the institutional approval, is secondary. Imagination is more important than knowledge. A 26-year-old patent clerk proved it. And the universe, the entire, incomprehensibly vast, mind-bendingly strange universe, confirmed it. Einstein imagined what nobody else could see. But our final rule, the last stop on this 2,500-year journey, goes back to where it all began. Back to Athens. Back to a barefoot man in the marketplace who asked one simple question and was willing to die for the answer. He could have escaped. His friends had bribed the guards. The boat was waiting. All he had to do was walk out of the cell, cross the harbor, and disappear. Socrates refused. And that refusal, that deliberate, clear-eyed choice to die rather than run, is perhaps the most important moment in the history of Western thought. Because it proved that philosophy isn't just something you think about. It's something you're willing to die for. Socrates was born around 470 BC in Athens, the son of a stonemason and a midwife. He had a broad, flat nose, bulging eyes, and a belly. He walked barefoot through the streets of Athens in the same threadbare cloak, summer and winter. He was, by every physical standard of Greek beauty, ugly. He knew it. He joked about it. But when he opened his mouth, everything changed. Socrates spent his life in the Athenian agora, the marketplace, doing one thing, asking questions. He questioned everyone. Politicians, generals, poets, craftsmen, merchants. He would engage them in conversation, ask them to define something they claimed to understand, justice, courage, virtue, beauty, and then, through a series of patient, relentless questions, demonstrate that they didn't actually understand it at all. This is the Socratic method, and it made him the most famous man in Athens. It also made him the most dangerous. Because here's the thing about Socrates' questioning. It didn't just reveal ignorance, it revealed the pretense of knowledge. The politician who claimed to know what justice means didn't. The general who claimed to understand courage couldn't define it. The poet who claimed to channel divine wisdom was making it up. And these were powerful men. Men who didn't appreciate being shown up by a barefoot stonemason's son in front of a crowd. Socrates fought as a hoplite soldier in 3 major battles, Potidaea, Amphipolis, and Delium. He was noted for his extraordinary physical endurance and his courage under fire. At Delium, during a chaotic retreat, he was the last man to leave the field, walking slowly and calmly while the enemy closed in, turning occasionally to stare down any pursuer. His companion Laches later said that if more Athenians had fought like Socrates, the battle would have gone differently. He wasn't just a talker. He could back it up. But his real battlefield was the mind. And in 399 BC, Athens turned on him. The charges were corrupting the youth and impiety, failing to recognize the gods of the state, and introducing new divinities. The real reason was political. Athens had just lost the Peloponnesian War. The city was humiliated, unstable, and looking for scapegoats. Several of Socrates' former students had been involved in the tyrannical government that briefly ruled Athens after the war. The association was enough. The trial was held before a jury of 501 Athenian citizens. Socrates defended himself, but not in the way you'd expect. He didn't grovel. He didn't apologize. He didn't promise to stop questioning people. Instead, he compared himself to a gadfly, a persistent, annoying insect that keeps a sluggish horse awake. "I am the gadfly of Athens," he told the jury. "I sting you to keep you from falling asleep." The jury found him guilty, by a margin of about 60 votes out of 501. Now, in Athenian law, the convicted could propose an alternative punishment. Socrates was expected to suggest exile, which the jury would almost certainly have accepted. Problem solved. He leaves Athens. Everyone saves face. Life goes on. Instead, Socrates suggested that the city reward him with free meals at the Prytaneum, the dining hall reserved for Olympic champions and heroes of the state. He was, he explained, doing Athens the greatest service any citizen could perform by teaching them to examine their own beliefs. He deserved a reward, not a punishment. The jury, predictably, was not amused. They sentenced him to death by hemlock. His friends were horrified. Crito, one of his closest companions, visited him in prison and laid out the escape plan. The guards had been bribed. A boat was waiting. Socrates could live out his days in exile, teaching, thinking, questioning. Socrates listened patiently. And then he said no. If he ran, he explained, he would be admitting that the laws of Athens were wrong to condemn him, and in doing so, he would undermine the very system of law and civic responsibility that he'd spent his life defending. More importantly, he would be proving that he didn't actually believe what he taught. If the unexamined life is not worth living, then a life lived in flight from one's own convictions isn't worth living either. He chose death over hypocrisy. The execution is described in Plato's Phaedo, and it is one of the most moving scenes in all of literature. Socrates spent his final hours in conversation with his students, discussing the immortality of the soul. He was calm, almost cheerful. When the jailer brought the cup of hemlock, Socrates took it without hesitation. His friends wept. He told them to stop. He drank the poison. He walked around the cell until his legs grew heavy, then lay down. The numbness crept up from his feet. When it reached his abdomen, he uncovered his face one last time and spoke his final words. "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please, don't forget to pay the debt." Asclepius was the god of healing. A rooster was the traditional offering for someone who had been cured of an illness. Scholars have debated those last words for 2,400 years. The most common interpretation, Socrates was saying that death is the cure for life, that dying was a healing, that he was being released from the illness of bodily existence into something greater. He died with a debt on his mind, not his own debts, a debt to a god, a debt of gratitude. The unexamined life is not worth living. That single sentence, spoken at his trial, is the foundation stone of Western philosophy. Not because it's clever, because the man who said it proved it. He examined his life. He examined everyone else's life. And when the world punished him for it, he chose death rather than stop examining. Here's what Socrates teaches us. Most of us are living unexamined lives. We're running on autopilot, following routines we never chose, holding beliefs we never questioned, pursuing goals that were handed to us by parents, teachers, advertisers, and algorithms. We go through the motions without ever stopping to ask, is this actually what I believe? Is this the life I would choose if I started from scratch? Socrates says, the unexamined life is not worth living, not that it's suboptimal, not that it's less fulfilling, not worth living. That's extreme. It's meant to be, because the alternative, the examined life, requires something terrifying. It requires honesty. It requires admitting what you don't know. It requires questioning the beliefs that make you comfortable. It requires looking at yourself, really looking and accepting what you find. It requires being the gadfly, stinging yourself awake. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, I'll leave you with Socrates' question. The one he asked every person he met, in every conversation he ever had. What do you think you know that you might be wrong about? Sit with that. Don't rush to answer. Just sit with it. The unexamined life is not worth living, and the examination begins right now. And so we come to the end of our journey. 21 lives, 2,500 years. A slave with a broken leg. A novelist who stood before a firing squad. A psychiatrist who rebuilt his life's work while dying of typhus. An emperor writing himself reminders to be humble. A samurai who gave away everything in a cave. A scientist who tore up $300 million. A merchant shipwrecked into founding the most enduring philosophy in history. A psychologist who descended into his own darkness. A sage who walked into the mountains and vanished. A philosopher who rehearsed his own death every day. A homeless man in a clay jar who was envied by a conqueror. A president whose friends hid the knives. A man who gave a 90-minute speech with a bullet in his chest. A prince who walked out of paradise to find the truth. A woman whose notebooks are still radioactive a century later. A poet whose heartbreak illuminated 800 years of human darkness. A prisoner who chose forgiveness over revenge. A minister who lost everything and found self-reliance in the wreckage. A genius with no education who taught himself to see the world differently. A patent clerk who rewrote the laws of the universe from a desk drawer. And a philosopher who chose death over silence. They never met. They spoke different languages. They lived in different centuries, on different continents, under different skies. And yet, they all arrived at the same place. Freedom is internal. Suffering has meaning. Less is more. The darkness is where the light enters. What you fear is almost never as bad as you imagined. The worst thing that ever happens to you might be the best thing that ever happens to you. Forgiveness sets you free. Comfort keeps you asleep. The wound is the doorway. Understanding, even when it costs everything, is always better than fear. Trust yourself. Never stop learning. Never underestimate the power of imagination. And above all, examine your life. Because the unexamined life is not worth living. These aren't just rules. These are battle scars turned into wisdom. Every single lesson on this list was paid for with something. Freedom, health, family, sanity, life itself. These thinkers didn't just theorize about the human condition. They lived it. They bled for it. Some of them died for it. And here is the secret takeaway. The one that ties all 21 together. It's not any single rule. It's this. These people didn't just know their philosophy. They practiced it every day, in the hardest moments. When it would have been easier to give up, to compromise, to look away, they showed up. They lived what they believed. That's the real lesson. Not just knowing the right thing, doing it, being it every single day, especially when it's hard. You are not the person things happen to. You are the person who chooses how to respond. That choice, that tiny, invisible, indestructible choice, is what separates Epictetus from his chains, Frankl from his suffering, Diogenes from his poverty, Mandela from his bitterness, Leonardo from his illegitimacy, Einstein from his desk drawer, Socrates from his hemlock. And it's available to you, right now, tonight, tomorrow morning, always. Whatever you're carrying, whatever is keeping you awake, whatever question you've been afraid to ask. These 21 lives are your answer. Not because they make the pain disappear, but because they prove that pain isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, nightlings. And wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues.